Thank you all for joining us. I hope you've had a nice afternoon. I know that being online for long periods is taxing, but I have to say the talks that I listened to were very stimulating indeed. And I know that our third and final speaker is going to keep us enthralled over the coming hour. Our final speaker is Dr. Sabine Hauert. She is an associate professor of swarm engineering at the University of Bristol and Bristol Robotics Laboratory. She has expertise in engineering swarms across scales, nanoparticles for cancer treatment, and robots for logistics, and her work uses bioinspiration and machine learning to engineer desired swarm behaviors. She has been widely published, including in Science Robotics, Science Advances, Trends in Biotechnology, and she leads a team of 15 PhD students and postdocs. She's also been funded under the Horizon 2020 scheme, among other projects. Her websites receive over 1 million page views per year, and she has 30,000 followers on social media. I mean, I'm hugely impressed by that in particular, I have to say. As an expert in science communication with 10 years of experience, Sabine is often invited to discuss the future of robotics and AI, including in journals like Science and Nature. Her work has been featured in mainstream media, including the BBC, CNN, The Guardian, and New Scientist. Her talk today is on swarms for people, and I would like now to pass over to her. But before I do, I just want to add that if you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand closer to the end, or you can add your question in the chat. I will be monitoring those. If you could just add a note to say whether you want to ask your own question aloud, or if you want me to read it for you, you can also send it in private message to me. And now I pass to you. Thank you, Sabine.
That's great. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And thank you for the introduction as well. I was in the sessions this afternoon, and it was quite fun learning about computational creativity. It's actually quite relaxing. We had beautiful music and art, and so that was quite inspiring leading up to this talk, hopefully. So I want to bring you on a journey with me today, looking at swarms really across scales. So I'll be going from robots down to nanoparticles and then back to the robotics world. And really, I want to go beyond doing swarms for the fun of it and start thinking about how we might introduce swarms for people, getting them outside of the lab into real world environments. So like many swarm engineers, my source of inspiration is this flock of birds. And there's many features that are interesting and useful for real world applications. So for example, if you keep adding birds to the flock continues to fly, so they can scale to huge numbers. If a bird falls to the ground, the whole flock doesn't crash, so they're robust to individual failure. And together, they can do more than the sum of their parts. So for example, they might be better at avoiding a predator. And they're just generally really beautiful and coordinated. It's quite impressive to see what they can do. And what's exciting is that these flocks operate and do these beautiful dances, not because there's a leader in the flock or a plan telling every bird where to go, but through local interactions of every bird with their local environment. And that's what leads to the emergence of these beautiful dances. And so if you start to think about self-organization, you see examples of self-organization or swarming everywhere around you, whether it's ants as they create trails to your picnic table, or bees as they make decisions about their next nest site, or our ability to grow fully functioning shapes, or humans, using just a couple of cells. So as a swarm engineer, very often we're given a group behavior, a collective behavior, a swarm behavior that we want to achieve. For example, flock, create trails, make decisions, build functional shapes. And what we need to discover is how to engineer the individuals and those simple rules that they follow, that local set of perception that they use that give rise to these emergent properties. And so we really have two different ways in our team of doing that. One is that we use bioinspiration. So we're lucky that biologists for many years have studied birds and ants and bees and cellular systems. And so we can take inspiration from some of the rules that they have, transform them, and then embed them into artificial systems. Or increasingly, we use exploration. And we use exploration when there is no well-fitted bioinspiration. What exploration means is essentially we guess the rules. So it could be that we're guessing the rules, in front of our computer screen. It could be that lots of people are helping us guess the rules, which is essentially crowdsourcing. Or it could be that we use machine learning to automatically test lots of these rules and help us discover which rules give rise to desired swarm behaviors. So with bioinspiration, the neat thing is once you have the rules, you can sometimes go ahead and test some of these systems in reality. So what you're seeing here is work from my PhD at EPFL and Dario Floriano's lab. I'm behind the screen. And what we did here is implement flocking rules. So it looks quite pixelated. We hadn't yet mastered the art of all this video production. But what you're seeing here is the GPS trajectory of those 10 robots. And they're following a simple set of rules. They're attracted to their neighbors. That allows them to stay as a cohesive block. They're repulsed from their neighbors. That allows them to avoid collisions. And they align their heading. And that allows them to sort of move in the same direction. And so using those 3 simple rules, as predicted, we end up with patterns that move in a collective manner. And here you're going to see it starts messy, but over time we get these circles. And so that's also, we see this in simulation, and this is indeed what we see with the GPS trajectories. That was fun, but when I was doing that PhD in my mind, I thought, 10 robots is just not enough for a swarm. And swarms in my mind needed to be much, much bigger in number. And to be much, much bigger in number at the time, I thought the way to do that was to be much, much smaller in size of the agents. And so I spent 3 years at a laboratory at MIT in Sagita Bhatia's lab, which was studying how nanoparticles could be interesting for the delivery of drugs to tumors. And what was interesting with these particles was because of their size, which was nanometer scaled, they were quite good at going through vessels. So you'd inject them in the bloodstream, they'd go through the vessels, and then they would leak out. That's why there's holes in this vessel here into the tumor tissue. And they would accumulate in those tumor tissues, only certain types of tumors. And so that size and that ability to arrive into tumors made them useful vehicles for the delivery of drugs or diagnostics within these tumors. And what got me excited is these particles operated in the 10 to the power 13. So that was a huge number that made me think, there's a swarm that we can do something with. And the particles that they designed in the laboratory came in different sizes. They could engineer them with different shapes. They could change their charge. They could change their materials. Some of them were energy receptive, so you could shine light or use magnetic fields, and that would activate the particle. You could decorate the particle with molecules that allowed it to stick to receptors on cancer cells or indeed to each other. So you could get some form of self-assembly. And you could release things, a drug, for example, or another chemical signal in the environment that could be used. And so in my mind, there were many knobs that you could turn on the design of these particles. So unlike my flying robots that I programmed, it was a Linux board and I gave them code. Here, the way we programmed the nanoparticles was to think about how we turn the knobs on the design of these particles so that when you inject 10 to the power 13, they do what you want them to do as a collective. And so just as a thought experiment, here's just 2 knobs that we're turning on the design of these particles. One is the size of the particle, and that changes how fast they move. And the other is the coating of the particle. Sorry. And that changes how sticky they are to the cancer cells. So what we're doing is these particles leak out of the vessel, and we want them to get eaten up, stick to the cells, get eaten up and kill the cancer cells up to 20 cells deep. That would be a good depth to nicely treat a certain portion of tumors. So 2 knobs that we turn, and actually if you simulate that and your goal is to kill 20 cells, you realize that most of those particles don't kill 20 cells. Actually, many of them, once they leak out of the vessel, they kill 1 or 2 cancer cells. And it makes sense because if you make a particle that's very sticky, if you're a bioengineer, you think, well, actually, that's a brilliant particle because it sticks to cancer cells and kills it. But if you think of the dynamics, they're all sticking to the same cancer cell right after they leak out. And so that's a poor collective behavior because all of those particles are sticking to the same cells. And so just those 2 knobs give you all these different behaviors in terms of where they would go into a tumor tissue. So this was just a proof of concept that thinking about the dynamics of nanosystems in biomedical applications was useful. And since then, we've advanced our models. So we have more realistic simulations. We can see where they're sticking on virtual cancer cells. And we have little tumors on a chip So this here is a microfluidic device. In red, you have little particles with gels, which are there to mimic a tumor. And in blue and green, you can monitor where they're going within these artificial tumor tissues. And this is now part of a bigger European project called EvoNano, where our ultimate goal is to give a clinical scenario, use machine learning and some of our multi-scale modeling to come up with a suitable nanoparticle, test that in these little tumors on a chip or in vivo before selecting interesting candidates to go to the clinic. And we have a new code base that's out now, which allows us to basically grow virtual tumors, cut out little tumor slices in silico, do this machine learning using artificial evolution, and it comes up with nanoparticle designs that turn those knobs that I was mentioning before. So that was fun in terms of thinking about the applications of it, but we were really keen as well on making systems that were more swarmy and maybe easier to explore beyond those first scenarios that we'd done. So we designed a game called NanoDoc that allowed us to crowdsource the design of these nanoparticles. And we would basically teach the crowd, okay, here's a tumor cell and you have a certain lethal dose. Here's a healthy cell and there's a lethal dose. Why do we have healthy cells? Because the solution to every treatment is to dump loads of drugs unless you have these healthy cells, to think about how to make it more specific or harmful to the rest of the body. You can change the dosage of those particles. You could combine particles so they can work together. You could change the size of the particle, which changes its speed. You could cells could have receptors on their surface, and particles could bind to those receptors. So you could coat them and they could bind with different strengths. You could load them, and you can make smart materials where if something binds to your particle, you release something in the environment. And these particles could self-assemble and disassemble, which changes their size, which changes their speed. So if you think from a swarm robotics perspective, what we usually, these particles have the ability to change their speed. They can sense their environment. Based on what they sense, they can release something in the environment. That thing they release could activate another particle. So now you have communication. And through self-assembly and disassembly, you can stop or speed up or slow down. You can't go left and right like my robots, but you do have a toggle that you can control on the particle motion. And so that's essentially a lot of the building blocks that we want to be able to use at the nano and the micro scale. And here's just an example. This is what the game looked like back then. So people would design particles, they would leak out of the vessels, they would see the output, and they could quickly iterate on the design of these particles. So this was the case of being sticky or not. But we could actually produce dynamics that looked a bit odd, like things that accumulated far from the vessels because they communicated. So here are two particles that communicate, that create weird dynamics within these tissues. And this game was played. We had around 180,000 simulations, which allowed us to think a little bit differently about the problem and come up with interesting solutions. But really what we used this for was also to play our own game, to come up with some ideas of what we could do that looked a little bit more swarmy. And so here what you see is a trail that we formed using a much simpler version of the ant rules to create trails, because our particles can't go left and right like ants. They move through random motion. And yet you'll learn a little bit more about how this works. We're able to create these trails in simulation with nanoparticle dynamics from this point in the upper left to something in the bottom right here that we might be interested in finding. Now, with this idea of engineering more swarmy behaviors at the nanoscale, could we do decision making? Could we do trail formation? Could we make them flock? Could we do some of the things we used to do in robots, but at the micro and nanoscale? And we realized that we're missing a playground at that scale to quickly engineer our agents, because we can't reprogram them and we need to change the body of these agents. And changing the body of these agents takes sometimes years of research, a PhD, to change one functionality. Or if you want them to communicate, release a chemical, that means you need to find the right chemical particle, you need to find the right thing to release. It's theoretically feasible, but not easy or fast to do. And it could be particles, it could be that you're interested in bacteria and mammalian cells and microparticles. So we wanted a playground to help us think about how we could engineer micro or nano swarms. So we created this device called the Dome for dynamic optical microenvironments. And what it allows us to do is interact with micro and nano systems using light. And we've got thousands and thousands of pixels that we can play with thanks to this projector, which uses little micro mirrors that flip on or off. You can project in red, green, blue, but you could change the LED. And then our swarm lives here on the sample, and we can see what's happening with the camera. And based on what's happening with the camera, we have Raspberry Pis here that change what's projected. And so we have this mechanism to basically interact with micro nano swarms. And we built this all using off-the-shelf parts. It's around 700 pounds if you want to make your own. The plans are on bioarchive now. With the idea that we want to be able to quickly change this because our swarms interact with different lights, and we visualize them in different ways. And sometimes we need to zoom in or zoom out. So this allows us to control the specs of our device for pretty cheap. This is an example of our playground. So here you see little volvox. These are little algae that are several hundred microns in size. And I'm just showing three capabilities from the swarm world. One is communication. So what you see here are the real volvox moving in our little Petri dish, but the colors that you see are the projections that we have on them. And we're pretending that they can communicate. So here they're sending messages within a little blue halo. And then anyone who enters that blue halo can propagate that information. So you can sort of see this blue message propagate through the swarm. So communication is one building block. And you can imagine we can quickly iterate and change those communication halos so that we can change, that playground of testing very quickly. How we could design swarms at the microscale is something that we are interested in. Here, the volvox, those little algae are depositing light, a little bit like ants would deposit chemical trails. And you can see it actually influences their behavior because they stop in light. So can we use this to do things like explore an environment a little bit more efficiently? And here what you're seeing is us controlling their motion through a stop and go. So on illumination, these volvox slow down or stop. So that's something that we've now managed to build, and we're looking at new playgrounds or things that we can put in there, whether they're reactive life forms or reactive microparticles, so that we can do some of these swarmy behaviors we're interested in. And this is just a cute video that Anna made, who's really the brains behind the dome, showing Game of Life, but seeded through the natural life. So it's basically a projection of the Game of Life rules on top of these volvox's position, depending on what they activate. And it's just a cute kind of merge, I think, between the virtual and the real, the biological and the virtual world, and how they can come together to play games. So now that we have a playground on the micro nanoscale, the things that we want to engineer as swarms, again, are sort of both swarms that are cool, but also swarms that are profoundly useful, hopefully in the biomedical sense. So whether you think of cancer cell populations and trying to understand the dynamics of those tissue sheets, can we be zapping the right cells using light, reorganizing those cellular populations, or understanding something about how those cells swarm, for example, to escape their primary tumor to go to secondary tumors? One of my postdocs is interested in biofilms, and can we understand how, again, to impact the colony of bacteria so that we can break up, hopefully, these biofilms. And then in materials, can we make cool pattern materials or materials with functionality where the function is described by how or what we illuminate in space and time? So that's the nano micro side. And the reason I dive into that is because it's changed the way we think about robots to a certain extent. So if you're thinking of designing a farming robot right now to plant seeds, you might design a tractor that zigzags through the farm fields and sequentially plants a bunch of seeds, one after the other. It would be a pretty sophisticated robot, quite expensive, and it works the way we think machines should work. But if you think in the way these nanosystems work, actually what you might be designing is 100 million robot seeds that are soft and biodegradable, essentially deploy and disperse over the environment and then plant themselves with what they need to be sustained. So they're single time use, much larger numbers, a little bit of autonomy might get you the automatic deployment over these areas. And that's much closer to the way we think of things in the micro and the nano world. And I think this idea of using really simple agents even at the macro scale, but in huge numbers, works. So here is an example of trail formation. So that algorithm from the nano world where we release something and then it finds something in the environment and creates a trail, that works out of the box on robots. So here you're seeing little kilobots. These are coin-sized robots that are very simple. We have 1,000 of them in the lab. So what you're seeing here is the real robots. They have 2 vibrating motors, so they can move left, right, and straight. But because of their vibrating motors, they're very imprecise. So we like to do random motion with them. They have a little LED to show us what state they're in. They can communicate using infrared within 10 centimeters, and we can project light patterns on them, which gives us a way of changing their environment. So again, random walks here. And the only rule, which is the same rule we used in the nano simulator, was if you find something, you need to stick to that area and you need to start basically emitting a signal so that anyone else in your environment sticks. And if anyone is a physicist here, this is a version of diffusion limited aggregation, which is the snowflake algorithm. It's a way of from a seed growing a snowflake, except we truncate it so that it only creates a limb. And this finds the nearest object. It avoids obstacles and goes around them if the obstacles are present. So we get interesting features for free just through random motion and very local interactions. This here is decision making. So robots are deciding between blue and red using an algorithm inspired from the honeybees. Blue is the decision we want them to converge to because it's the better decision. Red is the worst one. And green is noise that we're injecting to make the system more robust. And you can see it starts blue and red here. And quite quickly, it converges to blue. And here, if you look at their motion, some are moving fast, some are stopped. So again, this notion of very random motion and just local communication. And yet this is at the level of 400 robots. We quickly get convergence. And finally, here what you're seeing is shape formation in collaboration with James Sharp, who studies morphogenesis or embryogenesis. And let me just stop this to explain this a little bit more. So here what we're doing with 350 of our little coin-sized kilobot robots is that these robots their aim is to create shapes. And in this case, shapes in our world is to create limbed structure. So they start as a blob and we want them to be able to grow extensions. And the way they do that is using Turing patterns. So here our robots have morphogens that are stored, and they use rules from Alan Turing to basically exchange these virtual chemicals, these virtual morphogens. And based on this simple exchange, these spots emerge. Okay, these spots represent areas of high morphogen concentration. And this is just virtual, it's stored on the robots. But the cool thing is these spots and these stripes is what Alan Turing was describing originally with these patterns. So this is what we see also emerge at the level of the swarm. And then we use these patterns, just like would happen in certain elements of embryogenesis, to grow areas that need to be grown. So here our robots basically navigate around the swarm until they enter an area of growth and they join the area of growth, and they're constantly recomputing these morphogens. So you'll see these patterns, they move and they look, actually, if you look at it, it looks a little bit, looks quite organic. So you can see it kind of grow here and here and here. There's a couple features that are useful as well because it's self-organized. If you chop the limbs off of this system, they regrow. If you split the swarm, so here we cut these, and either they regrow or they reallocate their robots. And you can see there's all these instabilities and stuff that happen that frankly, we haven't wrapped our head around. So here we split it and it's regrown, and then a new Turing spot appears. So that's an area that could now grow from here. And then finally, just on this idea of kind of minimalist and random, almost random walkers with simple chemical or message exchanges, this is sort of our physical implementation, because the kilobots, they live in the lab. And so we're starting to think about, well, if we actually had something that we could send out that would do 10 jumps or 6 jumps or however it's useful, but there were hundreds of them, we would need them to biodegrade. We would need them to be powered by rain. We would need them to look a little bit differently. So we're designing a new robot for stochastic swarms, which is all based on probabilistic deployment. And this is just 1 or 2 jumps. But we're working on the paper we've submitted has them coated with sensors, and then the reason you see a splash is because their latches are dissolved using water. So it's still conceptual, but this idea of what do these stochastic robots that work in huge numbers look like? And I think they probably look very different from the ones we have now. So I mentioned bioinspiration, and that was a deep dive, I think, from the bioinspiration across scales. But in many applications where we're not dealing with thousands of robots, and we have something that's maybe more down to earth or applied to do, we need to design our own collective behaviors that are fit for purpose. And so for that, we use machine learning. And so here what you're seeing is a swarm of robots designed by Simon Jones and Alan Winfield, and also with Matthew Studley. And these robots have GPUs on board. So we call it a teraflop swarm because it has lots of computation on board each individual robot. And the reason that's interesting is it allows these robots to do artificial evolution on board, so that we can start them not knowing how to do a task, and then they learn by running evolution on board how to push this frisbee. If anyone wants me to explain artificial evolution more in detail, I'm happy to at the end. But simply put, they start with random controllers. They're running so fast that the next thing they test has already been evolved for hundreds of generations. And then you can see at the beginning, they're not very good at pushing this frisbee to one side. Here, that's not a very good success. But over time, they sort of figure it out. In real world time, it takes 15 minutes to get a performance that we're happy with. And this, the reason we're trying to do it on board is if you were to send them in the wild, or you were to send them on Mars, you wouldn't have potentially a whole computational infrastructure where you could learn the system off board and then test it on the robots. And it also allows them locally to adapt, because in this evolutionary model, every robot has a model that they're evolving, and then they're sharing good solutions across the swarm. But it could be that for this corner of the space, one set of solutions works better than for this corner of the space. And so this might give us additional adaptability, although we haven't tested that. What we are doing in this evolutionary sense is to try to evolve, or to use machine learning to design controllers for robot swarms that are human understandable. Swarms are already complex enough through their emergence. And so it would be useful if at least we could query the robots and ask them what behavior they were running. And these behavior trees come from the gaming industry, and they're very useful in the swarm context. We can read them and sort of parse what they're doing. You can color code your behavior, or you can annotate it. So if you rerun the simulation, you can say, okay, well, here I was in the 0 zone, so maybe I was running B1 here, or actually B2. And if I come here, I'm running B1 when I see the frisbee. So it helps you explain a little bit more what's happening behind the scenes. And so that's something that we've been expanding now in our team, is sort of putting in place automatic ways of evolving behavior trees for our robot swarms. So reaching this point, I think we now have the ability to create hardware for robot swarms, and we'll see more hardware at the end of this presentation. We have the ability to make lots of robots. We have the ability to design algorithms, whether they're bio-inspired or whether we need to evolve new controllers. But a lot of the work has been lab-based, and I think we're at a stage where this combination of hardware and algorithms, and also the fact that we can put this computation on board individual robots and make them a little less simple sometimes, means that we're probably ready to get some of these swarms into real-world applications. So we've started, I think the first thing, if you do want to get swarms to people, is to actually ask people what they think swarms would be useful for. So Danny created an escape room back in the days when we were allowed to be locked into closed, confined spaces, which sounds really weird now. And this escape room, basically you went in and you had to break free from the escape room, like any good escape room, by learning about swarming. So every puzzle that you had to crack would teach you something about swarm robotics and swarm engineering. And so we trialed this in Bristol over a couple of days. And then, you could have the photo ops and all of that. And then we asked people what they thought swarms would be useful for. So here's a table showing benefits for society and risks for society. Lots of ideas that the community had been thinking of, things like, cleaning up the ocean from plastics, nuclear decommissioning, mine clearance, construction, search and rescue, surveillance. So you can see here we start to shift towards the low benefits for society with more military applications, manipulating people in their decision-making process. Farming, which is interesting that it's here. Some odd ones like massages. So maybe, there's things that we hadn't thought of, monitoring the weather. But useful, in just a couple minutes, people came up with a lot of ways in which they thought swarms might be useful. They also, the other bit of what I do, so this is the escape room, but I also spend a lot of time communicating about robotics and AI in general through two charities that I co-lead. So one is robohub.org and one is aihub.org. So shout out if you ever want to communicate about your work. We're basically happy to support that in any way. So we put a lot of sort of, this is what swarms do and all of that. I think there's a story now from one of my colleagues, Moro, on swarm robotics. And then the last bit that we've really started is doing use case studies. So many of my newer PhD students now start their PhD by talking to the potential users. If they have a more applied project, some are more blue sky, and so they might not do that. So this user study was looking at warehouse storage, bridge inspection, and firefighting, and the potential uses of swarms in those areas. And we use a technique called mutual shaping. And what it is, it's a method to basically ask users what they want from the technology before you start to develop it. And it starts with a preliminary demonstration or a discussion about the technology, or a discussion about what their current challenges are. So for example, in the context of firefighting, we would ask them, how is firefighting done? How are robots used? And then we'd present a robot and a swarm solution. And then we'd ask them how that would be useful in their context. And so that's, it's basically lots of conversations that are semi-structured with users in the area. And I think that the thing that was neat with these discussions is every time I go to an event and you say you work in swarming, they'll bring Black Mirror on the carpet and you're like, oh yes, Black Mirror is the sci-fi version of that, but what does it look like for people in the day-to-day life? And when you put it in their context, so when you speak to someone in a food bank, which we did, about whether they'd use swarm robots to help organize their food bank, the science fiction doesn't come up. It's much more down to earth of actually, this is the task that I need done. This is not being done. We're not checking the expiration dates, for example, on our food, and we keep trying to take things out of the box and realizing they're expired, or we don't have the manpower to constantly be organizing this space. So many people actually thought swarm robotics had a potential in their workplace, especially for specific tasks that weren't being done well or weren't being done at all. And so those are areas where there was an unmet need for the technology. We also discovered that in many of these, and this should have been maybe obvious, but they all have an art of their profession. So in the firefighting, for example, we were convinced, the reason we went there is because we designed a fireball that you could throw in and would like extinguish a little bit of a fire. And so we thought that was a brilliant idea. But when we spoke to the firefighters, they are the firefighters. That's fundamentally the art of their profession, is extinguishing fires. And so that's not something that they felt like they wanted something else to do or a robot to do. Instead, what they really would have liked is extra information so that they could do that profession better. So they wanted reconnaissance, they wanted to maybe be guided, they wanted all these bits that weren't the thing that we thought would be useful or accepted. Maybe accepted is the right word here. And so with this optimism or the potential also came a lot of concerns to get it right. So they're interested in it as long as we don't mess it up, or as long as the system doesn't perform poorly. So this notion of transparency and accountability, reliability and safety, and ease of training, use and maintenance were just themes that came up through these qualitative discussions. So with this in mind, I think we're trying to think about how people can interact with swarms now in a way that's a little bit more intuitive. So one is, we're not sure what a supervisor of a swarm would look like. So one person that sees, sends a command to a swarm and looks at what's happening at the level of the swarm. That's not obvious because they're so decentralized, right? The whole idea of not having a leader allows them to achieve these things. And yet when we bring humans in the loop, we do want them to have the oversight that makes them comfortable in what the system is doing. And so what we've started doing with Arthur Richards and Elliot Hogg is automatically designing supervisors for us to wrap our head around what a supervisor might look like. So these supervisors, they essentially send swarm commands to the swarm as a whole. And so we use behavior trees because we can understand those. So that means that once we've evolved supervisors, we can look at what cool behaviors were used, and we can maybe teach supervisors what would be efficient mechanisms of working with swarms. Or indeed, we could just use it as a good way to see what the swarm is doing, and you'll understand me in a second. And we run them on exploration tasks. So here, the goal of the swarm is to go and explore this environment. You can think of a search and rescue application. And the supervisor behavior is here. So here we're telling the swarm to go southeast with a certain value, and then we're telling it to disperse here with a certain value. So these are words that are easy to understand, and that maps to the behavior of the swarm as a whole. So we are not telling every robot where to do, we're really looking at it at a swarm level. And the algorithm to do that doesn't use the position of every robot, it just uses summary information, like what's the overall center of mass or spread of these robots. And we've tried that now in more realistic environments. So this here is the Bristol Robotics Laboratory where I work. And you can see again these behaviors that are being used. So here it's go east and go north and disperse. And actually sometimes with 5 or 6 behaviors, you can cover a whole complex environment like this. Whereas if you were to design this as a human, you'd almost want to remote control this. So I think there's something to be learned in how we can control swarms using very little commands that still do the job of exploring something like a complex real world environment. And Elliot's latest work basically closes doors and checks how it's robust. So if this were a fire and doors have been locked, how do we generate supervisors that are much simpler? And I think we're learning, we hope, we'll see, but guidelines like key take homes. So if you were to look at a map as a human, Elliot's now thinking, I think we need to do this type of swarm behavior, this type of swarm behavior. So that's the trajectory we're going in, is learning rules to control swarms from the supervisor's perspective. But we're also trying to make these swarms more expressive. So Marahan has been designing an artificial canvas using these robots because essentially they're pixels, if you want to use them that way. So she's thinking of interaction modalities. And here, let me just play that again. We have a sunset with this little red sun, and then she can paint pixels and copy paste them to make stars in the sky. And then she can paint them again and reset it. So there's all these little interaction modes with this robotic canvas that she can do, just as a way to think about how we reprogram or how we interact them in a more artistic sense. And indeed, how we can display shapes or figures using these swarms. So these are, lines and circles and all of that, using not too much material, because the challenge is if you put this whole blob, you would need like 600 robots to fill that. So we're trying to find ways to create shapes and lines that are, for now, functional, but in the future would be neat if they're expressive. So here you can see a simulation of 1,000 of these robots that are winking or spelling letters. And so you can imagine in the future, this might be emojis, swarmojis, little shapes or something that the swarm could form as a way to convey what's happening within their system. And we've also started thinking about ways in which, so those kilobots, again, they're in the lab, and all of this is about getting them out of the lab. So what's an interactive version of a robot swarm? And we've designed these new robots called tiles. They're little screens on wheels. They're about 10 centimeters, all Raspberry Pi based as well. And so we're in the final stages of making 100 of these robots. And the idea is that they could live in human crowds and help them brainstorm. You could imagine writing things on these Post-it notes, or you could input your opinion and see the dynamics of that opinion move through the room, maybe introduce you to someone with a different opinion, maybe use this as a form of deliberative democracy, and this is funded by Nesta. So we're currently building the platform, and we have user studies that are starting in 2 weeks, because we're allowed to resume some of these to think about how swarms and humans can maybe work together in a more efficient way. On the expressive side, Marahan's interested ultimately in using these as an expressive art form, a little bit like the robot canvas that you saw before. So if you assemble these screens, you again have little tiles that assemble as mosaics. And in June, I'll be sending around a link. You'll be able to play or basically control one of the robots, one of the 100 robots, and we'll be trying to make mosaics with the crowd. Okay, and the last, okay, so a little time. So then in terms of robots that get out of the lamb, a couple of things that we're trying to do. One is we have a new project to monitor basking sharks, and it's not about following where they go, where they eat. It's about looking at the inside of their mouth and basically looking how they process algae. And so we'll be designing a little robot that blasts a little plankton particles in there and tries to look at where they go. So that's one that's just started. Another project here is looking at how we can design swarms of drones for firefighting. So this is an aircraft by wind racers and distributed avionics, and it's a larger drone than the ones you saw before. It can carry 100 kilos for 1,000 kilometers. And so the goal of this project is, if we're looking at firefighting or aid delivery, we're going to need large numbers of these robots to work together to actually have an impact in any of these use cases. And so we're starting to design little algorithms that allow us to, or that can be tested on some of these larger aircrafts to think about how we could be useful in these real world applications. And a little view from the drone. Okay. And finally, this is the latest sort of real world swarm that we're working on. It's a new swarm for industrial logistics. In partnership with Toshiba, and this notion of an unmet need. So this came from these discussions that we had with the users. So the food banks, the small retail, that they don't have robots currently. They're not Amazon or Ocado. They don't. The reason Ocado and Amazon have so many robots is because they could invest in the research and development to make bespoke solutions and build custom infrastructure that fits these robots. And so what we're hoping is that swarms sort of fit a different space, where it's not about necessarily optimizing the performance, but hitting an unmet need with a good performance, but in a way that doesn't require that infrastructure or can be used out of the box with little training or little failure modes because of the swarminess of the system. So that's something that we're trying to explore now. We've built these new robots. There's 20 of them. These robots are called DOTS, for Distributed Organization and Transport Solutions. They've got little lifters, and they're the opposite end of the spectrum from the kilobots. They've got GPUs, high-spec comms, high-spec sensing for a robot of that size. They're about 20 centimeters. So that allows them now to do things that are much less random, like you saw before, much more controlled, but still in a swarmy, decentralized way. So we're really thinking about, even with random walks. So here you can see random walks, and what they're doing is trying to pick all the boxes and bring them to one side of the arena. And almost no intelligence on board these robots would still, in theory, get all these boxes to the delivery area just a little bit slower. But you wouldn't need to know anything about that world to be able to deploy them. So this arena is going to be remotely operated. So if anyone wants to test swarm behaviors, we'll be launching this in the next couple weeks, I hope, so that people can try swarm behaviors on these dots. So you would run simulations first in Gazebo and ROS, and then you could test them on the robots, and we'd show you a video of your robot operating. And this is, I think it's, so the question I often get with this is, why don't you do things like in a centralized way or in the same way that Amazon or Ocado might do them? And I think and I think the reason they ask for that is because they doubt that it would work. And I just want to highlight how I think it would work. So this is a toy scenario with a cloakroom. So the idea is there's an event and there's a pop-up space that you want to you want to install an automatic cloakroom in it. using robots. So in the classical sense, to do that, you would have a central computer that would have a map of that cloakroom space. A person would arrive to that central computer and say, I want to deposit my jacket. That central computer would call a robot to the person, and the person would put the jacket there. And then the central computer would plan where the robot goes, and it would go there. And then when the person comes back to retrieve their jacket, that central computer would remember, because it has a database, where that jacket was, retrieve the robot, command it to follow a certain trajectory so it's not hitting other robots, to deposit that jacket to the user. If you do this in a completely swarmy way, you don't have any of that central computer. Instead, everyone installs an app, a little Bluetooth app called Pick Up My Jacket or something. And then they pick up a box with a little QR code and scan it. And the nearest robot that gets that message stops there, and you put the box on that robot. And then that robot's going to move around, maybe even randomly, and stop somewhere and just leave the box there. So your cloakroom might look like a mess, might look like a spiral. It might be uniformly distributed. But when that person comes back to get the cloakroom, the jacket could stop anywhere and basically send a message saying, pick up my jacket. And because there's enough robots, you don't need a plan of that warehouse. Anyone who's nearby would basically look around like a human would do and see if they find that jacket and bring it back to the user. And so that, I think that's a system that could work. Actually, it's not as crazy to think of swarms as something that could be used out of the box. And that's something we're trying with these dots now, just at the early stages. So I keep thinking swarms are nearly there if we can get them out of the lab, but increasingly, I think it's more than that. It's if we can make them trustworthy. And there's a whole discussion going on. I'm going to leave time for questions just on how we make swarms trustworthy. And that's part of the bigger Trustworthy Autonomous Systems program in the UK. And it's hard because if you want to make swarms trustworthy or safe, and I know these words are not interchangeable, it's just finding the definitions for me as a learning curve. But you need to think about the ethics of it, the legal considerations. A lot of these systems, if you think of the drones, are not meant to operate as in that way yet. The failures can be at the level of the individual or the level of the swarm or the emergent properties. And so those are all things that we're trying to at least think about, although we don't yet have the answers for that. So that was the journey. It's the result of many people's expertise across disciplines, including PhD students and postdocs and collaborators. You can think of the chemical side. We have chemists and biologists and physicists and computer scientists, etc., as well as people who fund us. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Sabine. That was really fascinating. And just like yesterday, I have a question, but I'm afraid others have got there before me. So I'll pass first to Marinus. And then we have two other questions. And if you want to ask a question, okay, Giuseppe, I can see you as well. But Marinus, would you like to ask your question first?
Yeah, I was really interested to see you talking about communication and decision-making distributed among a swarm. I was wondering whether, while you were dealing with this kind of work, you came across evolutionary game theoretic approaches to decision-making and communication amongst automata. I'm thinking especially of Brian Skirms at UCI, who's done a lot on this kind of thing.
Yeah. We didn't try that or implement it. We really went, this is work with Mike Croscombe and Jonathan Laurie for the decision-making on the honeybee type of scenario. So I've come across that, we've just never implemented it or looked in that direction. Yeah. Okay,
and then from Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Sabine. It was a really interesting talk. Thank you very much for that. Lots to think about. Everyone, when they think about swarm robots, thinks about search and rescue. That's the first thing, you're expanding to cover an area, moving around in an area and so on. I was just wondering whether, and I think you partially may have begun to answer this with your cloakroom application, but how about actually fabricating using these devices? So something like maybe 3D printing a house, for example, which we've seen people do now. So maybe all the robots have a plan of the house and they all collaboratively work together, building the house. There's no central controller. Is that kind of work which is being thought about?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. On the construction and self-assembly side, there's definitely interest. So there's people like Kirsten Peterson, who did the Termes project with Radhika Nagpal, who had little termite-inspired robots that would build structures that were predefined, but using fully swarm decentralized plans. And I think swarms lend themselves really well to this. So at some point I was working with a startup that was building a little single brick carrier that would navigate structures and deposit a brick. And bricks rule-wise, I mean, walls rule-wise are really simple. Here's a line, and you go to a certain depth and you deposit a brick, and then the next one comes in and deposits a brick right after that. So the rules of wall laying are something that would lend itself quite well to a swarm. Then there's all sorts of traffic jams that can occur. So I think it makes a lot of sense to think of swarms in the construction context. We need to sort of figure out what objects look like as well, because I think where swarms might be really fun is to create structures that don't look like straight walls as well. So if you build a structure that's optimized for light, for example, maybe your structure looks very different than the way we design structures. And so I'd be quite interested as well in seeing how swarms using simple rules come up with structures that look completely different from the ones that we currently operate with in our construction world. The other thinking is all those works about shape formation, or indeed Marahan when she creates lines or circles, all of those, if you were to glue those entities together, you would end up with structures as well. So anything that has to do with shape formation in 2D can be thought of as a form of construction too, because once you have that shape, you could freeze it in space or bond it in some way. And that creates a structure essentially. So a lot of this is still 2D, 3D is always harder. And so, yeah, I think we need to think about how you climb structures, how you use drones, how you get to that third dimension.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have two more questions, one from Richard and then from Giuseppe. So Richard first.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you very much for a fascinating, very informative and very interesting talk. I very much enjoyed that. You mentioned a number of possible applications. Have you looked into the possibility of using swarm behavior for search and rescue? And if so, how would you go about training a swarm for that application?
Yeah, so for search and rescue was the original application. So those 10 drones at the very start, actually my PhD wasn't about flocking, it was about creating communication networks in disaster scenarios. So the other behaviors that I didn't show, they would create a trail of communication. That communication trail would search an environment, find someone that needed rescuing, and then would link them up to the rescuer's base station. So I think search and rescue makes sense when it's at scale, and you need that large coverage that would allow you where you need a swarm basically to have a crack at it. That project then and also pivoted to a project called Swarmix, which looked at avalanches and how you could use mixes of swarms between humans and dogs and drones to start to do things like search more efficiently in environments. And those little stochastic jumpers, you could imagine, if things could crawl into places that were hard to reach, maybe that's a really nice way that you could create trails to things that are interesting. So in the use cases with the firefighters, we asked them, would you want us to light the exit pathway in the building to sort of help you get out? Would you like us to help find things in the environment? And they were keen as long as we didn't get in the way. There's always that challenge of them, what are they going to do if they step on 100 robots that we've deployed and aren't operating? So things that are huge scale swarms make sense, I think, and things where you need access and you need to make your robots small for that access. And so you trade off that size for the numbers, I think also makes sense as swarms.
Great, thank you very much.
Giuseppe.
Okay, you can hear me. Beautiful talk, thank you very much. Exciting. I'm a physicist. I would like to know if you have considered an interplay between short-range interaction. I'm not so much, my question is not so much about application, but about swarm formation. If you have considered relation between short-range interaction among the elements of a swarm and long-range interaction, the interplay, and also if there is any study that you did about a critical number, I mean a number below which or above which you have or not have a swarm. This might be to me very much interesting.
That's a great question. For the different communication ranges, so for example, with the emergence with the Turing pattern morphogenesis, where we grow these limbs. We in the follow-up of that, we had two ranges of communication, one which was local to create patterning, and one which created long-scale gradients that attracted robots to areas of interest. So we do play around with different types of communications and their reaches that serve different purposes. Remind me the second one?
The second one was about the number, a critical number.
The number, yeah. So the number, yeah. So I've been wondering that because of the 1,000 versus the 20 that we have, sort of, and all these different range, or so the kilobots work in 1,000. The bigger robots that are more sophisticated work in the 20s. And so I've started wondering just more generally of how you think about our algorithms across scale and when they stop working. And one example of that is stigmergy. So we have a paper looking at stigmergy and its limitations when you reach huge numbers. And in stigmergy, you're depositing information in the environment. Our algorithm was really simple. We had kilobots and we wanted them to explore large space. And so they would deposit information, and other robots that interacted with that information, that footprint, would avoid it. And the thought was that would help us essentially scatter better over the environment because you're avoiding those footprints that other kilobots had been over. But that only works up to a certain number, because then you get saturation of space. And a lot of our algorithms break up. So there's two things. When the environment is bounded, our behaviors break down if we have too many agents, or intelligence no longer serves any purpose because most of the interactions are caused through these physical collisions, rather than the intelligence we're trying to embed at the level of the robots. Likewise, some of our really dumb behaviors, like the trail formation, they don't work if you have few robots. Or the morphogenesis doesn't. The reason James Sharp collaborated with us is because we had 1,000 robots, and he couldn't produce this behavior with 50 or 100. So there is something fundamental about the trade-off between individual intelligence and numbers and space.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to think about. So yeah, if you've got good rules for which one to pick when, I think we have an intuition, and we're sort of pushing the edges to see where it breaks, but we don't have a framework, which would be really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Because if not, I wanted to know more about artificial evolution that you were discussing earlier, if you have.
Yeah, sure. So the general idea behind artificial evolution, if the community, if some people might know, so the general idea is for our robot swarms, we start with a random program. So it could be a behavior tree or a neural network. And then we generate 100 of these robot programs, and we copy this robot program on the swarm, and then we test the swarm and we give it a score. And the score is usually our swarm behavior. So it could be create a flock or create a trail or optimize communication or explore this environment. And based on that score, we give a score to each one of these programs, and we rank them based on that. And then we mix these programs, which is our version of biological crossover, or we mutate them, which is our way to expand the search space. And then we generate a new generation of these controllers that we basically iterate on generation after generation. Usually this is done in simulation because every test takes a lot of time in the real robot world. So it'll take hundreds of generations before we have a program that we like. And so with behavior trees, what we're evolving is the tree itself, the code of the robot. And so the thing that's been tricky, sort of the next frontier, is, beyond involving something on a computer and testing it on the robot to see that it works, is how do we do this on board and more efficiently? And there's two ways I want that to work. One is on board the robot so that just locally it can quickly learn how to improve its swarm behavior. And for that, the challenge is, now every robot is a little artificial evolution engine. And if they did that all in a silo, they wouldn't be sharing any of their behavior. So there's no longer an incentive for the robots to cooperate if everyone's basically optimizing their own system. And if they're doing it on their computer, how do they see the swarm behavior score? So that's one of the challenges that we face, is how do we get scores for a swarm when you're evolving on board or not? So that's one element. And the other is in the dome, the microdome. So the thing to control microswarms, that's the thing we want to evolve now, is controlling cells and microparticles and all of that. And we don't yet have a good way to do that for those systems.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, actually. I think we've run out of time for questions. So unless there's something pressing, Okay, in that case, I think it falls to me to say thank you again very much. I enjoyed that. It was a fantastic talk, and I think the work you're doing is really both fascinating and also very important. And so thank you for joining us and for your patience in waiting a year to come and speak to us.
Oh, thank you for the invite. It was really interesting to attend the sessions today.
I'm so pleased. In that case, I think it's time for me to close the convention. It's been really wonderful to see you all. Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry we can't now go to the pub and close the session properly, but I have my wine. I hope you have yours, and I wish you a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Till next year.
Thanks, everyone, especially Yasmin.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Sabine.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Yeah, keep well, everyone.